You'll hear that announcement. And generally, we'll hear from Dr. Thompson and Lynch as part of their presentation, and then we should have time for questions and discussion afterwards. So with that, I'll turn it over to them for introductions and the presentation. Thank you again, Laura and Abigail.
Great, thanks, Scott. I'm going to go ahead, if I can share my screen to get started. I think this is it, or let me do this one. And can you guys confirm that it's sharing it looks like it's sharing the PowerPoint slide at this point, but yeah. Well, first, thank you again for the opportunity to join you all today. Thanks, Scott, for the invitation. As Scott mentioned, Laura and I are with the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center, and today we're going to present a bit about this RAD, or Resist, Accept, Direct climate change kind of adaptation framework. And just before we get started, we wanted to give a little bit of an overview on the program that we work for. So we work for the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, and the main mission of our program is really to help deliver science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to changing climates. And the focus of our program, as evidenced by the name, is on really the impacts and adaptation aspect of it. And in doing this, most of the work that we do is centered around helping managers protect public lands and the natural resources on them. We do a lot of work collaborating with tribes and indigenous communities and other vulnerable communities to help prepare for climate risks. And there is a fairly strong educational and training component to our program as well. So we have a number of different opportunities where we're trying to help cultivate the next generation of climate adaptation professionals. And so our program is divided into a regional kind of a layout where we have 9 regional adaptation science centers and 1 national center. So I'm based actually in Virginia, but in Northern Virginia, and Laura is also with the National Center, but she's based out of Tennessee. In addition to the National Center, there are these 9 regional centers, and they are a federal and university partnership where there is a federal regional administrator and then a university lead, and all of the different regional casts are consortiums where there's a number of universities that participate in the program. So now, kind of to shift gears back to RAD, or this Resist, Accept, Direct framework. Over the course of this presentation, we hope to convey really a few basic points. First, we're going to start with the premise that we understand that ecosystems are changing right now in a very unprecedented way. If we continue to use the same approaches that we have in the past, then we are likely to be unsuccessful in designing effective management strategies to meet these new changes, or new changes and new challenges. So there's been a large group, a community of folks that have been working in this space, and we've all been kind of collaboratively developing this RAD, or Resist, Accept, Direct framework. And we see this as a useful tool to help navigate this kind of unfamiliar territory of systems change. And we'll introduce this RAD framework, and then in the end, we're going to try to focus on how to make this all practical, and in a way that it can be implemented. So, this may be a new way of looking at things, but there are a large suite of tools that address these issues that are really not that radical. And there are a lot of existing tools that we can use. So, to begin this presentation, we're going to focus mostly on the first premise that ecosystems are changing. And for this, I'll give a very short personal example, and then I'm going to transition over to, or pass the baton over to Laura to do more of an overview, and then I'll come back and finish out the presentation with some of the kind of next steps for implementation. So to start with this short personal example, and explain a little bit more about this picture in the background. This is actually a photo of my family from a few years ago now at Hunting Island State Park, which is in South Carolina, near Beaufort. If folks aren't necessarily familiar with that area, it's about a 2-hour drive south of Charleston, and is one of the most popular state parks in South Carolina. And I think there's something like over 1 million visitors that come to this state park each year. And so even though, and I should also premise that I'm a fish biologist and Laura's a wildlife biologist. So some of the examples that I may be giving are much more aquatic based, but Laura is our in-house wildlife biologist. So, and where I mostly work is inland fish and inland fisheries. But when I think of kind of a very stark example of ecosystem change, I often have this image of Hunting Island in my mind. And I think this is, for me, and maybe many others, because climate change is often such an intangible process that operates at very long timescales, but in a few systems, such as coastal systems like this one, that are experiencing sea level rise, those kind of long-term impacts are very clearly recognizable within the human timescales of understanding. And so there are fast events like, for example, hurricanes that can dramatically change these landscapes in basically overnight. And these fast events are becoming increasingly frequent, and they complement or as a result of having more slow ongoing processes like sea level rise. So, so this is just kind of a short personal timeline of Hunting Island and my experience with Hunting Island. And then it's always kind of nice to include a dog picture. I think Laura might, maybe one of Laura's dogs will show up when she starts presenting too. But so this is a picture of my dog on Hunting Island in 2014. And this is actually a picture from my wedding day. My husband and I got married in Beaufort. And so Eric took Ben to Hunting Island before the wedding. But the main point of showing this photo is I want you to look at the landscape in the background. And you can see that it's very heavily forested in 2014. So there were pines, palmetto palms, and there were even live oaks that were right up to the beach at this time. And in fact, when you would drive out to the beach from the park entrance, it felt kind of like you were driving through a prehistoric jungle. So much so that they actually used Hunting Island to stand in for the Vietnam scenes in Forrest Gump. So just as like a fun movie trivia side fact, a lot of Forrest Gump was actually filmed in and around Beaufort, and including these Vietnam scenes, which were filmed right on Hunting Island. But so moving ahead a couple years, so this was 2016, Hurricane Matthew hit Hunting Island, and it hit Beaufort pretty dead on. And so my family actually ended up, my family who lives in that area ended up coming to stay with us during that time. And people weren't allowed back on these sea islands for quite a while. There was lots of big, very old live oaks that came down in the area. And there was a very long-term cleanup effort to get things kind of reestablished. And so the state park was closed for quite a long time to remove down trees and debris, and the recreational areas were just not accessible for folks during this time. So fast forward again to 2017, the park reopened and folks were able to come back in about the summer of 2017. So this is basically a whole year later. And this is my son, Miles, who is now in first grade. So this is, again, the time scales of things you can see here. But even now in this picture, again, I want to direct you more to the scenery in the background. But the canopy, you can notice, is already quite a bit thinner than it was in that photo with Ben the dog in 2014. And so, and at this time, a lot of the infrastructure was also limited. And so it was about a full year after that hurricane before the park was able to reopen. And again, it wasn't even fully reopened to what it was beforehand. But then in 2017, they were hit by another storm. So this one was Hurricane Irma. And now this storm was not nearly the same strength as Hurricane Matthew, but the water levels were higher. And so it was enough to generate a 15 to 20 foot storm surge, and it flooded out all of the electrical systems on the island again. And so ordinarily, this portion of the South Carolina coast is pretty protected from storms just based on kind of the structure of the coastline. And so it hadn't really been a very vulnerable spot. More storms obviously hit the Outer Banks and the likes of those. So having these two back-to-back storms were really very substantial in terms of recovery. So, by the time my family was able to get back to Hunting Island again, it was Christmas of 2018, and the park had fully reopened, but there was still a bunch of downed trees like the one that Ben and my family are standing on. And many of the roads were still quite impassable. Then fast forward again to this is now the summer of 2020. And I think at this stage, one of the most obvious kind of changes to the landscape here is that they had tried to implement a very large, massive beach nourishment program. So they built up the dunes, they added grass plantings, and you can tell that the beach really looks substantially different than it did from that initial picture back with Ben, where there's basically no trees other than palm trees that are left. Much of that kind of prehistoric jungle looking landscape is completely gone in attempt to, at this point, try to armor the coastline against further storms. And so then this is one last picture from last Christmas. And you can see that there has been, now there's a substantial beach that's located there. The forested part of the island is still experiencing quite dramatic change. Many of the trees are slowly dying from this continued inundation of salt water. And while there have been what they call ghost forests on Hunting Island for a while, they're rapidly and visibly expanding. And I just wanted to highlight one quick plug for this piece from NPR. It was from November in 2021. And it's a really nice piece of climate change communication that's showcasing kind of the impacts of sea level rise on Hunting Island. And it actually features a good friend of mine. Her name is Laura Clark, shown in this photo. And there's a lot of great imagery in that story about these ghost forests. And there's some great conversations with Laura and some of the local fishermen in the area, and also the local Gullah and Geechee Nation individuals as well. So just very quickly to kind of like go summarize kind of this experience, even as in this like very relatively short time span, we've seen dramatic changes occurring across this landscape. And so in addition to those ecosystem level changes, there have also been management interventions to address those transformations. And so I just present this little vignette to kind of tee up the remainder of the talk. And this is a personal example for me, but I imagine many folks on the call can also have similar sorts of examples where you've seen how impactful these ecosystem transformations can be. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing quickly and then let Laura share to transition to the next stage of the talk.
Sorry, I'm just trying, so you all can see my desktop, is that
We
right?
can see your desktop right now, Laura.
Okay.
Yes. So now it's showing the presenter mode.
Okay,
There we go.
okay.
Go for it.
All right. So thank you, Abby, for that intro, kind of in this personal example. And just to kind of reiterate these transformations that Abby kind of described just over the short time period, these are happening globally. And so an example in the Arctic, so sea ice is retreating, and walruses that you typically hang out on the sea ice to feed are now having to go up on beaches to kind of hang out, and there's an increased risk of stampede mortality, so it's kind of negatively affecting walrus populations. In South Africa, the altitudinal limit of savannas is increasing and spreading into grassland ecosystems. This picture shown here. In tropical oceans, rising ocean temperatures and ocean acidification are causing mass coral bleaching events, which affect a large number of species that kind of depend on these reef structures. In the Great Basin and the Cedar Mountains, grassification of habitat has been occurring with the fire-induced invasion of cheatgrass. And then probably one of the most visually stark examples are glaciers that are disappearing, retreating, and as well as mountain snowpack, like shown here in Glacier National Park. And so some of these disappearing glaciers have actually led to species like the meltwater stonefly that depend on glacial melt for a large portion of their life cycle being listed by the Endangered Species Act. So ecosystem change, although it's been pretty much occurring since the beginning of time, it's not a new thing, but the current causes of ecosystem change are unprecedented. Historically, the main driver of change was natural climate variability, followed by this glacial, interglacial time scales. But now we know that most of the ecosystem change is anthropogenically derived. So we have climate change and land use change, disease and invasive species, habitat fragmentation. All these different factors are causing ecosystem transformations to occur at unprecedented rates and spatial extents. But in the near term, even if these transformations aren't happening in your system, it might be easier to think that these longer term changes may be nothing to worry about, but the delayed action can actually increase the risk of irreversible change in things like ecosystem structure and function and composition, and result in lost opportunities to adapt to ecosystem changes. And so this type of paralysis can equate to higher cumulative economic costs, loss of ecosystem services, and potentially more consequences for natural systems. So we need like a common lexicon for having uncomfortable conversations about what comes next when we can no longer maintain ecosystems or restore or rehabilitate ecosystems to what they once were. And so we have to start thinking about other options. And so that's where the RAD framework comes in. So we've introduced this framework to kind of help initiate these conversations about what comes next for ecosystem transformations. So RAD stands for resist, accept, or direct, which is kind of an all-encompassing management framework. There's nothing really left outside the decision space. And so the real value of RAD is you're able to kind of lay out these options and be deliberate in thinking about how each one might represent trade-offs among management goals, societal values, and available resources, including monetary resources. And one of the big advantages is that it kind of creates this lexicon that is needed for having these uncomfortable conversations. So, and also it's got a catchy acronym. So, digging into each of the three options, we'll start with resist. So this strategy is basically where managers focus on current or historical ecosystem structure and function. And this is kind of could be described as more of the comfortable space for most natural resource practitioners. Essentially, many of the precautionary principles of management, restore, rehabilitate, maintain, conserve, they could all kind of fall into this category. So for example, restoring a creek bank with riparian vegetation would be kind of an example of resist, to kind of provide this cooling and shading needed for species in that particular ecosystem. Moving on to the accept option, this is where managers maybe don't necessarily intervene, but they allow the ecosystem structure and function to emerge from ongoing transformations. And sometimes this could be like a common choice simply because there aren't available resources to intervene in any sort of meaningful way. But it can also be a deliberate choice rather than a default decision. Sometimes the outcomes could be harmful or maybe even desirable. One example of where accepted change is occurring is in the lower 48, where moose populations are disappearing, largely because of disease, kind of this proximate causes of climate change impacts. And then deer populations are increasing because of warming or milder winters, but it also provides hunting opportunities for some of these northern states in the lower 48. So this is kind of an example where some of these changes are tolerable. And finally, moving on to the direct strategy. So this is where a manager might choose to actively steward a particular ecosystem towards a preferred new state. And this probably is an option that maybe gets the broadest pushback in terms of implementation. Also values and beliefs may be involved to keep things natural. It's normal for people not to like change. And it kind of flies in the face of precautionary approaches to management. So an example of directed change might be translocating bull trout, a species that's kind of getting increasingly its habitats and some of its streams that are warming are getting stressed, and so they're moving them into upstream locations where they weren't found historically, where they had a more ability to persist long term in the future. And it's important to note that these options are not necessarily mutually exclusive. For example, in Minnesota, there's a common forage fish, the cisco, that's important for species like walleye, provide prey for those sport fish. And so managers in the state are actively creating refuge lakes for cisco to kind of in areas where they're more likely to maintain the species, particularly small lakes with lots of surrounding vegetation. But in other areas of the state, there's lots of agriculture and recreation, so they're largely allowing these cisco populations to disappear in those areas. So they're kind of making choices where to resist and where to accept at the same time. So how does one decide when to choose whether to resist, accept, or direct? So there's several different factors that could come into play. There's considerations of space, spatial scale. So for example, a manager working at a small scale, like a park or a refuge, may be able to more easily implement some of these suite of options because they can manage it more intensively, work with limited budgets. But the disadvantage of working at these smaller scales is that surrounding areas could be managed differently, and you could have spillover effects. When operating at larger scales, the advantage is that you have the full distribution of the ecosystem, or a community or species, whatever your target might be. But it can also be costly, and you're dealing with multiple jurisdictional boundaries. And it can be hard to get buy-in from a large number of stakeholders at some of these larger scales. Also, considerations of time. Resist may only be feasible in the short term before changes become so drastic that accepting or directing change are the only options. And also, there may be mismatches among decision timelines and the speed of ecosystem change. So managers often have to make decisions within a certain period of time, but the speed of ecosystem change can be very rapid, as Abby described, or it could be very slow and gradual. And then there's also the issue of social change and the speed to which it occurs. For example, removing a popular fishery in an area could take a long time to kind of get some buy-in from the public on some of those issues. And then considerations of magnitude, or sometimes we refer to this as comprehensiveness of change. This can vary and may affect whether one chooses to resist, accept, or direct. So, for example, if the magnitude of change is essentially just a single species is disappearing, that would be kind of a lower magnitude change versus multiple species within a guild or multiple functional groups, or the disappearance of an entire ecosystem. For example, we're seeing in some parts around the Amazon in South America where forests are increasingly being transformed to savanna areas. So the RAD framework in theory is pretty intuitive. And so in being able to understand what strategy to pick and when we know, when do we change strategies. But the problem is if we wait too long, that resistance is futile, then we may have already missed opportunities to prepare for adapting to ecosystem change under a RAD strategy. And it will be likely to cost a lot more. There's greater loss of ecosystem services, and just generally more consequences to natural systems. So I'm going to hand it back over to Abby now, and she's going to kind of give us some pointers on what might be, how we could kind of approach this.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Yeah, so in terms of kind of thinking about that overarching framework of how all those components fit together, the next step is really trying to operationalize RAD. So, even though this framing of RAD may be somewhat of a new outlook, in reality, there's a lot of strategies that we can use to adopt RAD that are already kind of in the existing toolbox for natural resource managers. And again, I'll just give a few quick examples. And again, because I'm from the aquatics and fishery side, these are all going to be fisheries examples here, but I think there's a lot of parallels to the wildlife side as well. So some of the more kind of typical examples for that fall kind of in the resist strategy would be something like stocking, or removing invasive species, or the riparian shading, like the one that Laura mentioned in the earlier example, or something like a put and take fishery, where you're just putting the fish in, but you know that they can't survive there other than just using it as recreation. In the more accept category, things could end up being like stopping stocking if it's not, if the locations are no longer able to support any sort of population of a fish. You can adjust harvest levels to kind of ensure that populations are not maybe additionally overstressed based on ecological conditions. Apologies for the dog in the background. That's Ben, who was in the earlier picture. You could even potentially close fisheries at certain times based on kind of environmental variables. For example, if the temperatures are too warm and having a fishery would additionally stress fish to the point of mortality events. Aquaculture is maybe a more controversial potential option, but there are definitely directions where folks are thinking about using that for any potential kind of lost wild fisheries. And then the direct options, those are the ones that are even broader, kind of sky's the limit sort of approaches. But so translocation of impacted species, this was the example that Laura gave with respect to the bull trout. So this can be conservation introductions or assisted migration, that sort of line of thinking, it would definitely fall within that directed space. You could even consider doing aquaculture for different species that might be more tolerant of new conditions based on climate change. So these are kind of general examples of what these strategies are, but kind of knowing how to use those is still a difficult or maybe a daunting task for resource managers. And so a number of folks within this broader RAD community worked together to think about how to potentially orient to appropriate strategies within their decision space. And so just to orient you to how this matrix will be presented, we've basically been thinking about or simplifying these RAD choices down to two axes. So first, you have how your system is capable of responding on an ecological scale. So this would be something like whether or not your system will respond to intervention. So something low on this spectrum would be something like the open ocean, and something high on this would be a small pond. So this relates back to Laura's kind of discussion on scale and scope too. And then the second kind of axis of the system is looking at societal receptivity to change. So this would be a spectrum from where stakeholders and partners are very, very resistant to change on the low end, to those that are very willing to think outside the box and more open to alternative opportunities. And so with this kind of very simplified structure, we can get a matrix of RAD scenarios from this. So the first one in this quadrant, we basically call cope. This is where managers can cope with ecosystem change. And this is when both the social and ecological controllability of a system is quite low. So in this kind of quadrant, you can look to more of these accept strategies on the ecological side of things, or potentially resist strategies more on the social side of things. And so something like this would be an example that would fall in this category would be something like a put and take fishery. So, the managers recognize that this is not a self-sustaining system. It cannot be maintained without intervention, but this is an important service that people want the stakeholders and communities want. So they continue to kind of support this put and take fishery. The second quadrant is where the social systems are quite averse to change still, but the ecological systems themselves are able to be more manipulated. And so this is the quadrant where we say that managers can kind of engineer this domain by employing really any ecological type of strategy, but strategies that are focused mostly on the social side of resisting. So an example in this category would likely be something like a large-scale restoration effort to maintain or rehabilitate a system that has undergone dramatic change, but you could still kind of bring it back to what it was. The third quadrant is where that societal receptivity to change is quite high. but the ecological systems are not very responsive to intervention. So in this quadrant, we say that managers are able to innovate for new management, kind of a new management frontier. And so in this quadrant, they can employ accept strategies that are focused on the ecological system, and really any type of strategy that is focused on the social side of things. And so this would be something like, for example, looking to foster new fishing or hunting opportunities for species that are newly established in the region. And this would be something like the example that Laura gave, in terms of, moose populations declining, but new or deer populations are increasing. So potentially altering hunting regulations to optimize that new landscape. And then the last of this quadrant is where both the social and ecological controllability are quite high. And so this one, managers have kind of a space to think about many diverse options. And so this could be employing any sort of ecological or social RAD strategies, but the focus being kind of more on the possibility of doing direct strategies. And so, this could be introducing genetically modified species, for example, that might be more suitable to changing conditions. And, we see the utility of this sort of matrix in showing managers where they are in their kind of RAD landscape of decisions, and kind of what options are feasible for them at that time. And it shows, if, for example, managers might be in a certain quadrant, what types of levers they have if they want to move to a different quadrant. So if we could push, high bounds of societal receptivity to change, then you could move, for example, from the cope and engineer quadrants up to the innovate and create quadrants. And, when you think about things like COVID, those things may actually be more easy to kind of sway than we had previously thought. So it's maybe one minor silver lining to something like COVID in terms of quickly changing societal habits and behaviors. So I guess just to bring things back to the beginning a bit here at the end, as a reminder, we started with this premise that our systems are changing in unprecedented ways. And if the past no longer reflects the future, management approaches that still look to the past for precedent will become increasingly untenable. And so this can be quite a daunting task. And we're in a position where we can be like, well, what can we do in that situation? And so that's kind of how this community that has been focusing on RAD really kind of, it came together to develop this simple framing tool to kind of help navigate that unfamiliar territory or have those uncomfortable conversations like Laura mentioned on dealing with this systems change. And framing action within RAD, it often can still involve these many tried and true methods. It's just thinking deliberately about what the available options are within that decision space, and then acknowledging using that kind of controllability matrix where we are within that decision space to help best prepare for adapting ecosystem change, as well as kind of minimizing costs and consequences to ecosystems. And so just as one last kind of final kind of summary or synthesis on RAD, I hope if you remember anything about RAD, I hope you remember these kind of 5 kind of main points. And so when we think about RAD, we think about this as helping us manage directional change. So this is not just focused on environmental variability. It's addressing a situation where the change is going in a directed way. It encompasses what we're calling the full decision space. So it opens up the range of options that are usually considered. So, if we're in the headspace of thinking about what our management strategies have been in the past, we might ignore or not acknowledge these other potential options that can be useful in making decisions in the present. And then a third point, and this one I think is key for folks that are first learning about RAD, is that it's not a prescriptive tool. So it will provide a menu of adaptation options for what you could do, but you need to utilize another tool, such as structured decision-making or any host of other types of approaches, or adaptive management, for example, to help identify what you should do. So RAD is just laying out the options. Another type of decision tool is necessary to help you identify what you should do. And then, as Laura mentioned in her example with Cisco, all of these RAD options are not mutually exclusive. So they can be applied sequentially. So starting with a resist approach and then moving to an accept approach, for example, or they can be applied concurrently across a landscape or space. And so this would be something more akin to a portfolio approach, using multiple options on the same landscape. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, while some outcomes from decisions are surely irreversible, no RAD decision is ever final. So, these RAD choices need to be revisited with change, using other decision processes, and be perpetually reevaluated as things continue to change. So with that, I'll just close and thank everyone for attending. And Laura and my email addresses are there. We'd be happy to communicate further if there's any questions or comments. And then I'll also flag that there is a USGS website that is specifically focused on RAD resources. So there's a lot more information there if anyone's interested.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Abigail and Laura. We certainly have time for questions and discussion out there. If you want to, we're a relatively small group, so if anyone wants to turn their microphone on and/or camera and kind of join in that as a conversation, we can do that, or feel free to type a question in the chat. I wanted to start us off first by, of course, thanking you, and I'm wondering, what if you could tell us a little bit more about you, as you just mentioned this website that you have available to help groups start to consider this framework. Are you and or others at the Climate Science Center also available to sort of shepherd that process, or have you been involved in specific applications? And how does one get that started, if that's possible?
Oh, go ahead, Laura.
Well, yeah, and so one thing that we maybe didn't emphasize enough during the talk is that this is a large scale collaborative effort that introducing and kind of providing this RAD framework and in these different publications and resources. There are a large number of agencies and universities and nonprofits that were involved in kind of producing these different products. And so we have Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, USGS, and just to name a few. And so there are a number of case studies. I think there is a working group that's largely federally focused, but they're kind of building this suite of case studies that we're in kind of pinpointing where people are using the RAD framework, just so managers, when they want to think about this tool, if there's like kind of proof of concept that this is where it's been done and this is where it's being considered. Yeah, there are people that can assist with some of these questions. Abby and I are largely just research scientists, so we don't probably interact as much with the public maybe as some Fish and Wildlife and Service people, and but yeah, some of the manager groups we do interact with quite a bit, and we have some people in our shop that we're bringing on a will-rise candidate to kind of liaison with practitioners as we're with regards to the RAD framework. So, and Abby, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, maybe just to add there, I mean, as Laura mentioned in the federal space, I was involved earlier this year. Like the Fish and Wildlife Service has done a large training process to kind of help integrate RAD into their decision processes across many programs within the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then maybe on a smaller scale, Laura and I have been involved in projects that have actually implemented things more locally. And so one example that comes to mind on as a project that I had collaborated on was looking at stocking in Wisconsin. So this was a collaborative project with the Wisconsin DNR, where they're looking to decide kind of which lakes they should stock walleye in, and which lakes might not be a good use of funding to continue to stock based on climate conditions and projected climate conditions. And so we basically overlaid RAD in their decision process or their decision analysis to kind of identify which lakes would likely be good candidates to continue stocking efforts based on their climate projections and based on kind of use in the around them. So it was not a decision for each individual lake. It was like a decision for the lake in the context of the other lakes around it. So in that case, we did develop a decision support tool looking at lakes, but it was overlaid with the RAD framework for kind of identifying those potential processes. So yeah, so that's a few examples. There's a few other ones working just offhand, working with Minnesota DNR, and then the GLFWC is the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, I think, is if I got that acronym right. But so we've had a few kind of training workshops and exercises where we've worked with those kind of state management agencies on that scale too, state and tribal management agencies. But nothing in Virginia yet that I know of.
Well, that may change. Just following on that example that you used for Minnesota for the walleye stocking. So based on your experience with that, what would you say was the driving factor for that agency to arrive at this decision that they needed to apply this framework in the first place? Were they dealing with like a constraint of like their capacity to provide, like, was it, let's say, number of fish that they are able to stock in a year? Was it longevity for those activities? Like, what was the driving reason for them to make
I guess funding is probably the ultimate question. And any management agency is of course going to be limited on the financial side, and so they were basically trying to identify how to optimize their use of funds across multiple priorities. And stocking is very intensive in terms of staff time and costs, and so and arguably there are not great returns on that investment. And so they wanted to be able to have a defensible, science-driven means of supporting decisions where they might decide to stop stocking, because that could be very controversial in terms of their stakeholder base.
Okay.
Yeah,
that makes sense. So being able to say, how did you arrive at the decision? It makes a lot of sense. Like I said, I invite anybody else to jump in here. I'll keep asking questions. It strikes me that as I'm sure you're aware, all states are getting ready for a revision for their state wildlife action planning documents through the Fish and Wildlife Service. Have you heard any have you been contacted by various states working on that about the possibility for RAD as a framework to inform that process? Because it seems like that would be an ideal place for states who are trying to sort of grapple with their management responses to these species of greatest conservation need.
I have not been contacted by any states, but I'm pretty sure that the climate science centers, or that's what we used to be. Sorry, the climate adaptation science centers. They do play. There's, as Abby mentioned, there's we have the regional centers that work probably more with the stakeholders in each region, whereas Abby and I are at the national center. But I do know that some of the CAST are actively involved with some of the state agencies in their swap, but to what extent the RAD framework is being considered, and I'm not aware off the top of my head. Abby, I don't know if you know.
Yeah, Laura, I do know of one. So there, through the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, but I think the project is actually regional in scope. They're developing some sort of synthesis document to prepare for that next round of swap reports. I don't know if that's the right word, but so a postdoc working with, I believe, Michelle Stodinger reached out to, I think there is a section in that document that's related to RAD as one of the potential tools. So, but I'm not sure exactly. That's not a very good answer in terms of, like, I don't know when that tool, I assume it will be available prior to when states are finalizing their next plans. But I'm sorry, I don't have more information offhand.
Yeah, I think it's like a guidance document that the state agencies can use as they're planning for kind of this next round. So
so I think there is a RAD component in that.
Yeah,
it seems like a logical place to, at least when you have such a broad effort across so many states with so many different players involved, having sort of a common language or people starting to use the same framework to arrive at how are we prioritizing, or prioritizing sounds like triage, unfortunately. And so one of the things I like about this concept is it's not a triage. It's, in a way, it may be some level of acceptance based on other information, right? Social and science information to recognize that. And it makes it a lot more palatable. Well, I guess the hope would be it would be more palatable to a broader audience of constituents, I think, which is really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that accept kind of option, it's important to have some intention with these decisions, and I feel like accepting things can just be like a default decision, but if you frame it in this RAD context, it can be a very intentional decision to accept that this is going to happen, but it gives the decision makers a little more agency in terms of, like, acknowledging this and deciding to accept it. So.
Right, it's not, A is not for ambivalence. We don't want that.
Right, yeah.
I have one other question that's sort of related to this, but in your experience in these applications, you mentioned assisted migration, and this sort of steps outside of RAD specifically, but it always strikes me that assisted migration, for lack of a better term, is something that has been widespread in fisheries and fish management for centuries. Mm-hmm. And it seems like on the terrestrial side, there's a bit more resistance to that activity. Like, as you know, looking at picking animals up and trying to relocate them in areas with more favorable ecological conditions doesn't seem to be happening as much as at least I would have expected. Have you found, do you have any kind of thoughts on that, or in your experience where how those two things tend to differ in those communities and acceptance as an approach?
Yeah, so Abby and I are actually working on a paper now that's kind of more species focused, species range shifts and how to manage those. And there's definitely there's groups that are very resistant to the idea, and then there's those that are, like there's no other option, if we want to keep this species around or keep it viable for, any kind of period of time. And I don't know that the RAD framework can provide any solutions necessarily to those kind of problems, but I guess it does provide some discussion, some way to talk about it more in terms of like, well, if we don't do this, then this is likely what's going to happen, and this is really our only option if we want to keep the species. So yeah, Abby, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I totally agree with you, Scott, that on the aquatic side, I mean, people have been moving fish around forever. And so maybe it's like a little more, it's not as difficult of a leap on that end. But one point that I think will have some interesting implications in the near term is that there's now a new, with the Endangered Species Act, I think it's section 10J, which actually is specifically like allowing for experimental populations of endangered species. And so I assume that if that's implemented, it will be, not necessarily just aquatic species. And so that might be an opportunity for terrestrial species to also be, they have management options in this space for terrestrial species too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think also too, there's been a lot, I mean, in plants, there's maybe more openness to assisted migration, maybe more so than wildlife. There's also been a lot of articles published, about the consequences of, there's always the fear, oh, it's going to become invasive, and I think more and more research is showing that species that are kind of native species that are shifting the ranges are less likely to become invasive maybe than, a truly exotic species moving into a new area. So maybe more research would kind of help open those doors a bit more, have a little more confidence as far as potential consequences. Other things I think that people get concerned about, like disease. I know like some of the southern flying squirrel, northern flying squirrel, I think the southern flying squirrels are carry some kind of bacteria that are negatively affecting some of the northern flying. So there's examples like that. And then of course the moose deer is another example where deer carry brainworm, which are lethal to moose. So yeah, that in addition to some of the just kind of the ethical concerns about keeping things natural, there are definitely barriers for assisted migration.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for your time. I think I speak for others on it. Was very good, very interesting, and certainly something we're going to be hearing about a lot in the coming days. So for those of you that are still on, I'm going to throw this slide up here quick. We will have the next, this is hot off the press. Our next speaker will be on October 13th. It'll be our own Jeff Trollinger, and he'll be talking about some of the work he and the agency's doing on building relationships with the sovereign nations here in Virginia. So I'm sure that'll be very interesting. And you'll be seeing that go out on the listserv probably either later today or starting next week. So thank you, Abigail. And Laura, I'm sorry. I'm going to say, I was like, it's not Jennifer. Don't say that. For your time again and helping us kick this off. And thank you all for attending. Have a good rest of your day and have a good weekend.
Thanks, Scott. Have a good weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.